am really happy to be here with you today. Well, let me just tell you, I'm 80 years old, so I've been around the church for a good long while. And I taught church history at St. Vincent Seminary in Latrobe for 20 years. So I've worked with many of the clergy of the diocese who now are celebrating silver jubilees and past, and I think, oh, how could it possibly be that that many years have gone by? So I was really happy when Father Mealy contacted me about doing a presentation that would be videoed so that it could be used as well in the parishes, because I think it's just a tremendous opportunity for us to be able to address some of the insights that Pope Francis has opened through this Jubilee Year of Mercy. You can imagine that as Sisters of Mercy, we feel like the Jubilee year is kind of a shot in the arm for us, because now in every community meeting and all our prayers and all, we are all focusing in on Jubilee Year of Mercy and kind of rekindling a sense of awareness of that virtue. I think by any measure that you would want to use, these are interesting times in the church. I think for anyone who is between the ages of 1 and 90, their entire lifetime has been in a time of interesting years in the church, because there has been so much life and growth and change and worries and concerns and dark side and bright side and the whole reality that keeps us very aware that the church is a living institution and that the Holy Spirit continues to be with us through it all, and that is an encouraging thing. But these are particularly interesting times. What we're focusing in on today in terms of the Jubilee Year of Mercy, the papacy of Francis has brought a kind of feeling of new life in the church, fresh air. He's a person of dynamic personality as well as dynamic message. When you think about it, just last year, 2015, Pope Francis visited here in the United States. He spoke before our Congress, which was an amazing experience, listening to him and observing him doing that. First of all, it was amazing that he spoke in English. And secondly, it was amazing that he was clearly so knowledgeable about issues in the United States and so forthright in addressing what were issues that would be of concern to the church as well as to the nation. Shortly after his talk to Congress, he spoke to the United Nations. And there too took on immediately the very difficult issues. That was right in the early days of the Syrian refugee crises, and Pope Francis spoke directly about reaching out to refugees and to immigrants and to dealing with the problems that existed. And he spoke about war and peace, always tense issues in an institution like the United Nations. Then you remember he went to the Conference on Family Life in Philadelphia, huge gathering that he attended. And interestingly, Friday of this week, April the 8th, the document is to be released from the Vatican that Francis has written as the fruit of the various synods that have addressed the question of family life in the church. And that's to come out this Friday. So you want to Google, it's the title Amoris Laetitiae. And I'm sure it'll be easily available through Google, as well as eventually in print in the papers and so on. Not too many weeks after his visit to the United States, he was in a one-on-one meeting with the Patriarch Kirill in Havana. Interesting meeting place that they chose. And you probably noted in the newspaper that he was quoted when they first encountered each other. He said, "Finally." You know, finally. Centuries of history in between the last meeting between a patriarch and the Bishop of Rome. Then, most recently, his visit to Mexico. And again, if you read any of the texts of the talks that were given during his time in Mexico, both to the bishops and to the government leaders, he was forthright. He spoke to them about the drug problems in Mexico. He spoke to them about crime. He spoke to them about war. And he celebrated Mass on the border, literally on the border, so that attendees at the Mass were from Mexico and the United States, and many of them on the US side, undocumented peoples who were here. And he spoke head on about the issue of immigration and the challenges that that poses. So, as I said, by any measure, these are interesting times in the life of the church. Just watching those few events alone would lead us to say, oh, you know, a lot is going on. Now, in the context of all of that feeling of a lot going on, looking at the document which convoked the Jubilee Year of Mercy and what its message to us is and what the text includes seems to be a really important and actually interesting thing to do. The document, Misericordiae Vultus, is not long. And I used to teach in the seminary, and I would tell them they had to read the encyclicals, you know, firsthand, primary source material, and people would groan, you know, because it wasn't evening fireside reading. But my point was always, you can't talk about it if you haven't read it. You can't just talk about what newspapers say about things, because they might not have it right. And they'll have it in many different ways. Well, fortunately, Misericordiae is a short document. It's about 25, 26 paragraphs in length. When you run it off from the printer, it's about 15 pages. So it's not long, but it is filled with spiritual wisdom and things that can be inspirational for us and useful to us in our work in church ministry. It's clearly not just Pope Francis' personality. He has a message. In this document, Misericordiae, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, and hope. Those words over and over and over again, just constant repetition of those words. Compassion, mercy, forgiveness, and hope. He's using those as the central themes of the Jubilee Year of Mercy. It's interesting, toward the end of the document in paragraph 23, he points out that he selected this idea of mercy not only because it's such a basic Christian virtue, but also it's a basic virtue within the Jewish and the Islamic communities as well. In paragraph 23, he points out that for Jews and for Muslims, the concept of mercy is part of the daily prayer, as well as it is for us who are Christians. Lawrence Cunningham, who is a professor emeritus of theology at Notre Dame University, had an article in the Notre Dame magazine, the winter 2015-2016 issue, and in it he said, this sentence kind of caught my eye, "No pope of modern times has done more to demystify the Baroque vision of the papacy than Francis." And part of it, I am convinced, is the zeroing in on mercy, compassion, forgiveness, and hope. He's talking to the sinners, us, and he always includes himself in the sinners. A few weeks ago, a group of our sisters went to visit the Muslim mosque, which is there in Oakland near us. We did it as a gesture of friendship outreach because it's so difficult for Muslim Americans at this point in time. Well, there was a young woman who took us on a tour through the mosque, and she was completely garbed in the hijab and, the way we used to look not too many years ago. And she gave us the tour, and she told us a lot about Islam. And at the end, and it happened to be in the week that is the Church Unity Octave, so one of the sisters said, oh, you know, this is the week of Church Unity Octave. And we pray during that week especially for unity among Christian people. But this year, Pope Francis has explicitly asked that we include praying for Jews and Muslims in the week of Church Unity Octave. So this is what they were telling this young Muslim woman. And all of a sudden, and with enthusiasm that I could hardly portray, she said, I love Pope Francis. It struck me so funny, just, you know, her whole tradition and her whole experience of life, but she said, I love Pope Francis. Well, clearly, when I read Misericordiae, I said, here is part of what is that Francis mania that is worldwide at this point in time. He's talking in this document and emphasizing as the central core of the Jubilee Year of Mercy, human reality. We are sinners, but God loves us no matter. God's love of us has nothing to do with how good we are or are not. And so compassion, mercy, forgiveness, hope, you know, they keep weaving through. Now, I'd like to look at this document in two parts. First of all, its ecclesiological implications. And secondly, its pastoral implications. Both dimensions touch us in church in very real ways, and both have specific implications for pastoral ministry in the church. The work that you and I and all the people who will be watching us through the video do in church ministry. The ecclesiological implications first. You know, you understand ecclesiology is a study of the nature of the church. I think it would be accurate to say that Francis has already had a major impact on the way the church is perceived. It's like a new branding. You know, little snippets of conversation that have come up in different interviews or talks over the period of time that he's been Pope. His famous, "Who am I to judge?" when he was asked by the reporter about interaction with homosexual persons in the church. Who am I to judge? And then his wonderful image of the church is a giant tent. There's room for everybody. That was in the first year of his papacy when he was giving a talk, and he said, don't think of buildings in mortar and stone, think of the church as a giant tent. Room for everyone. And then another metaphor that he used, he said the church is a field hospital, a place where they bring the wounded. You know, it's all imagery that is focusing on human reality, the sinner, the real thing of the quest for God. At the very outset of the Syrian refugee crisis, when he was speaking to the bishops of Europe, Pope Francis asked that every family, every church, every religious order in Europe would take in one Syrian family. I mean, how practical. You know, in terms of addressing that crisis in a church-based way. Notice none of these things that I am indicating that he is saying or the metaphors he is using, none of them is indicating doctrinal change, but they are very major changes in perception in terms of ecclesiology, the way that we understand church, not just we, but we in the broadest sense. In Francis' words, quote, grace can transform the human heart and enable it to do something as great as to change the course of human history, end quote. He says we wrong God if we think he judges before he forgives. Francis' own words again, quote, God's judgment is always in the light of his mercy. It was interesting when he was in Philadelphia for the conference, it became known that one of his devotions was the Blessed Mother Mary under the name of Our Lady, Untier of Knots. Do you remember that? The one church in Philadelphia had all the knots hanging from all the ceiling and so on. Well, isn't it interesting just hearing what his theological and philosophical base is? You can get right away why Our Lady, Untier of Knots would appeal. In Misericordiae Vultus, Francis speaks of the rich symbolism of opening the door of mercy in Rome on December the 8th, 2015. You remember that's how the Jubilee year got started. He opened the door of mercy in Rome. Now, I want to just read this to you, paragraph 4. It's very explicit what his purpose was in selecting that day. These are Francis' own words, okay, not my interpretation. He says, quote, I have chosen the date of December the 8th because of its rich meaning in the recent history of the Church. In fact, I will open the Holy Door on the 50th anniversary of the closing of the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council. The Church feels a great need to keep this event alive. With the Council, the Church entered a new phase of her history. The Council Fathers strongly perceived as a true breath of the Holy Spirit a need to talk about God to men and women of their time in a more accessible way. The walls, which for too long had made the Church a kind of fortress, were torn down, and the time had come to proclaim the gospel in a new way. It was a new phase of the same evangelization that had existed from the beginning. It was a fresh undertaking for all Christians to bear witness to their faith with greater enthusiasm and conviction. The Church sensed a responsibility to be a living sign of the Father's love in the world. End quote. It's interesting that he explicitly links the Jubilee Year of Mercy with Vatican Council II and with the unfinished work of Vatican Council II in the ongoing effort of the Church to be in touch with the people of this time. Prior to Vatican II, the metaphor most commonly used to describe the Church was the fortress mentality. Francis used that very word here in the text. Fortress, you know, the old idea of the medieval fortress, the place where people went to be safe in time of a warfare or attack, and they crossed the bridge that went over the moat, and the bridge got pulled up, and then they were safely inside and closed. And Vatican II changed that metaphor from the fortress to the pilgrim people. The documents of Vatican II, the early writings that emerged from the Council Fathers, and then Pope John the 23rd, when they spoke to the public, used the term pilgrim people. People on the way, people journeying, people searching for God. At the Holy Door on December the 8th of 2015, when Francis opened that door, he said, "We want to remember another door which 50 years ago the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council opened to the world." He said the Jubilee year challenges us, quote, to not neglect the spirit which emerged from Vatican II, end quote. Now, Pope Francis is only 1 year younger than I, so he was in midlife in Vatican II. I guess I wasn't quite to midlife. I was still in the early side of it because I was in the novitiate. I remember I entered before Vatican II. Vatican II occurred while I was in the novitiate, and I remember those years and the years immediately following as being exhilarating in terms of vitality of life in the church and in the community. But that's what, the day when he was opening the door, those were his words, quote, we want to remember another door which 50 years ago the fathers of the Second Vatican Council opened to the world. The Jubilee year challenges us to not neglect the spirit which emerged from Vatican II. I think that connection is so very important because I think what he is naming is the need for the church to be where the community of sinners is, where the people are at any given point in history. And as is the nature of history, it evolves. It's changing. It's not the place where you pull up the moat and close the doors, unless you want to just wilt away and die, or be a museum. So, again, compassion, forgiveness, mercy, and hope. Francis is saying in the Jubilee Year of Mercy, we have to look to these virtues, we have to look to how the church can be the people of God, welcoming the sinner, reaching out to all who are seeking God, and being a place where people find hope in that search. He said, quote, the church is the place with open arms to welcome. The Eucharist is food for the journey. These are very central concepts that came out of the documents of Vatican II. One of the things that we come to understand as we go through this document and in all of the expressions of living the Jubilee Year of Mercy is that it's asking of us to be people who reach out. It's putting a great emphasis on outreach, on welcoming, rather than on being, self-protective or closing off. Now, that means that the church has to have a public role. It has to speak to the issues of the day. Francis says, our job is to give people hope. Our job. We who minister in the church, in any capacity, our job is to give people hope. When you go through the Misericordia document paragraph by paragraph, for example, in paragraph 6, he writes, God's power is revealed in mercy and forgiveness. This is a quote. God heals the brokenhearted, binds their wounds, feeds the hungry, seeks justice for the oppressed. In paragraph 7, God's mercy endures forever. In paragraph 9, he points out that the scriptures tell us over and over again about the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, God's compassion. He emphasizes that mercy overcomes everything. He points to the biblical admonition that forgiveness is 70 times 7. how many times should we forgive? 70 times 7. He points to the need to let go of anger, wrath, violence, and revenge because they impede joy. And joy is the fruit of hope. In paragraph 10, he says, mercy is the very foundation of the church's life. How she shows mercy and compassion is the measure of the church's credibility. In paragraph 11, he quotes John Paul II in Dives in Misericordia, the encyclical, expressing fear that we are losing our sense of mercy in modern life. And in paragraph 12, he points out that Jesus reached out, quote, to everyone without exception. So too must the church to be credible. So you can see, he's just going over and over again on that theme of mercy, the Jubilee year of mercy. Now, when he says the church has to have a public role in that context of compassion, mercy, forgiveness, and hope, he is pointing out the need to speak to issues. He's not speaking to them as politics. He's speaking to the moral dimension, and he and we have an obligation to speak to that, to the moral dimension. For example, when he had the Mass on the border, and some people got all bent out of shape that, he's meddling in U.S. politics. No, he's not talking about U.S. politics at all. That's our problem. He's talking about how people who believe in God treat immigrants, how people who are Christian treat refugees. And regardless of any political candidate who takes it as a personal affront, that's not what Pope Francis is doing, or any church person, in speaking to those issues. It is our obligation to speak to the moral dimension of such issues. What else is the church about? It's not just going and kneeling and piously praying. The kneeling and piously praying gives us the strength to live with people as we ought to live if we believe in Jesus Christ. And so when Francis had the Mass on the border, he was very deliberate in doing that. When he said to the bishops of Europe, every family should take in a Syrian family, he was very deliberate in doing that. Not a popular thing to have said in Europe any more than it was in the United States. But very deliberate for a church leader. And when he wrote the encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si', he was very deliberate in doing that. I'm struggling through reading that encyclical now. It is not a short document. It is a wonderful document, but it is not short, but this is duty, and I'm reading it. I mean, you can understand totally as you read that he is talking to the moral dimension. We have to deal with the politics of it. But he's talking to the moral dimension. When he says, our job is to give people hope. I often think part of the appeal, not only of him, but of his message, is that he smiles a lot. He's clearly a hope-filled person himself. I mean, the man has one lung. And he's traveling around the world. But he is a hope-filled person. On January 1st of this year, at the World Day of Peace observance at the Vatican, a reporter asked Pope Francis, "What gives you hope?" He said, "You keep talking about our message is to give hope." He said, "Right now, the world is looking pretty dark in a lot of ways, terrorism and the whole Middle Eastern war and all of the crises. What gives you hope?" And Francis hesitated for just a moment, and then he said, "Well, right now, I'm aware of two signs of hope." He said, "One is the Paris meeting to confront climate change, and a second is the United Nations meeting regarding sustainable development." Now, isn't it interesting that he named those two things? Both in a bigger world than the church, both in terms of outreach to human suffering, both issues that are loaded with political implications. But the two that he pulled out as, well, right now, these two things that are immediately on the calendar are what give me hope. So, the ecclesiological implications, I think the ecclesiological implications, that idea of our perception of the church, the branding of the church, the nature of the church, clearly in terms of the teachings that Pope Francis singles out in the document Misericordiae Vultus, and the focus that he has placed in this Jubilee Year of Mercy, clearly we are talking about a reshaping of what Vatican II spoke of as the church in the modern world. One of the two central documents from Vatican Council II, the church in the modern world. This is it in terms of using a single experience like a Jubilee year to again draw the whole church's attention on its role in the modern world. There are some very practical applications of all of this that could be used in your work with the groups with whom you meet in the various ministries that you represent in our diocese. For example, within a parish or any diocesan organization or any group with whom you meet, a wonderful basis of discussion, well, first of all, the document itself, to take Misericordiae Vultus and have a group read it and then talk about it, that could be a tremendous educational experience for any group within the church. But to take a statement like, what are the obstacles to Francis' vision of the church that you are aware of? And to have a conversation or discussion about that. What are the obstacles to Francis' vision of the church that you are aware of? Or perhaps, what are personal obstacles within you? And I don't mean just you sitting in this room, I mean you, the people that you work with, the groups that you work with. What are the obstacles within you? Why, for example, do some Catholics find it very alarming that Pope Francis wrote Laudato Si'? Or why do some Catholics find it very alarming that Pope Francis would have Mass on the border? What are the obstacles within you? What are personal obstacles? What are systemic obstacles? Another profound conversation could be, what gives you hope? And again, I mean the bigger you, all the yous that all of us work with. What gives you hope? What signs of hope do you observe among parishioners or among the young people that you work with, or among the groups that you meet in terms of evangelization? What signs of hope do you observe there? What signs of hope do they observe? Especially among the young, the future. I think youth ministry is just about the most important thing in the church in terms of the future. You know, it's been very interesting to watch the following of young people for Bernie Sanders, one of the two Democratic candidates. I mean, he is not a young man. He's got white hair, and he's bald, and he's got an old raspy voice, and he's been around a long time, and there's nothing youthful about him. But the young people are registering with political parties as they haven't done in decades. Now the measure will be, if they vote, you know, does that registration carry over to actually voting? That will be a very important measure. But the fact that young people right now are so interested in politics and in primaries, it says something about them being turned on for the future. I don't mean because it's Bernie Sanders. I mean because of it being involvement in politics to that degree, you know. It says something about them wanting to be shapers of the world they're going to live in. And maybe even says something about they don't think we've done such a hot job with it. Though he should be one of the we that hasn't done such a hot job, but he seems separate from that to the young people. Well, within our church ministry, we have to get in touch with how we can enable young people to be shapers of the church world as well. Am I concerned that young people aren't joining my religious order or any religious order, or there aren't the large number of vocations to diocesan priesthood or religious order priesthood that there used to be? No, I'm not concerned about it. I'm concerned about what will speak to them clearly enough about God and church that they want to be a part of it in whatever way, new ways they create. You know, the ongoing evolution of history, if it teaches us anything, teaches us that very few things stay the same. And we have to find a way to tap into what will be the door opener for young people to take the message of the gospel, the sacramental life, the Eucharist, into the future. And it's interesting when you observe, Pope John Paul had it, John the 23rd had it, Pope Francis has it. Those men, when they traveled about the world, also energized youth. Something they were tapping into that was real. And I think that that's what the Jubilee Year of Mercy is a shot in the arm for. You know, it's like a new energy for that. So the things that will happen in your ministry, in parishes and in diocesan groups that are set up for purposes of evangelization or catechetical education or youth activity or whatever, how can the church speak to the issues of our day? How does the church speak to the issues of our day, even the hot potato ones? How do we touch into the life of Jesus and apply his teaching in the context of the life that we are living right now? Mercy, compassion, forgiveness, and hope.